Hi, and welcome to Celebration Bar Review. We are doing a series, countdown series of the 10 myths about the bar exam. And this week we're going to look at myth number 8, and it's one of my favorites in a perverse sort of way. And the myth is very simply, work harder. If you work harder, the myth says, you'll pass the exam, or at least you'll do better on the exam. Now you might say, oh wait a minute, this guy he's crazy. I mean, everyone knows you have to work hard to pass the exam. And that's true. You do have to work hard. People that buy a bar review course and then it sits in the corner of their room, or they never go to class, or they never do any of the work, generally don't pass. Urban myths and urban rumors to the contrary. The problem that I want to talk about here, however, is the other side of the spectrum. There are those people who believe that the harder they work, the higher their score will go, as though that there's some essential correlation between hard work and success on the bar exam. Now, let's look at that myth in a little more detail. You see, the presumption here is that the correlative between working hard and score is 1-to-1. In other words, the harder you work, if you put in one more hour, it should result in X number of points improvement in your score. That's true to a basic minimum threshold. In other words, in most of our courses, it takes about 200 to 300 hours of study to complete the course. If you complete the course at the prescribed level of study, then you should have a passing score. That's the correlation that we've determined after doing this for many, many years with thousands of people. It's a pretty good, pretty tight correlation. The problem becomes when you find a student who says, well, let's assume that Jackson says I need 250 hours to complete the exam. But I'm pretty sure that I need more. In fact, I think I need 500 hours to complete the exam or to complete the review. Now, this person is working twice as hard as suggested. If the correlation were true, they'd get twice as high. They'd get double the score that's necessary to pass. So you'd say, well, obviously they're not going to get double the score, but I bet they pass by a lot. Oh, I wish they did. I wish they even passed. It would be fine. The problem is there's a point of diminishing return in your study. The harder you work to a certain level, you'll get results. Beyond that level, that tipping point, you'll actually start to see a diminishment in your scores, a diminishment in your results. Now, you might say, well, why would that be? I mean, it doesn't make sense. And at first blush, maybe it doesn't. But when you start to think about it in terms of when you were in law school, no matter where in the world you went to law school. You remember sitting in a 2-hour class? That's right, you do. Well, you remember the first hour and a half of it at least. By about the hour 45-minute mark, you don't remember very much. And by 2 hours, all you remember is, I want to get out of this room. Now imagine if that same class went 3 straight hours. And for some of you it did, a night student, for example. What if that same class went 4 hours, or 5 hours, or 6, or 7, or God forbid, 8 straight hours sitting in a classroom? How would you do then? Oh yeah. You would have what I politely call the bovine stare. You're lost. You're gone. You've lost your ability to concentrate and focus. Now, if that's true sitting in a classroom, why should it be any different when you're studying for the bar exam? In other words, there is a point of diminishing returns in your study. There's a point at which you've done too much. You can't absorb the material. The problem is that for those type A personalities who believe that the harder they work, the better they'll be, they try to gather everything. You know, they kind of remind me of the squirrels gathering nuts before the fall. You know, I got to get them all, I got to get them all. Well, it's okay to a point, but after you've gotten too many of them, you start to look like one of those squirrels from Chip and Dale. And I don't mean the dancers, I mean the squirrels. And you got too much and you drop them all. You see, you can only hold so much material in your brain. You can only do so much work. What I often see are students that work themselves into a frenzy. They panic thinking they have to know everything, and because they can't really know everything, you guessed what happens, they start to beat themselves up. I'm not learning enough, I can't memorize it, how am I going to remember this for 2 months or 3 months or 4 months or 6 months? And the answer is you won't. If your approach to the bar exam is to try and memorize, and that's one of the myths we'll come to later in this series, but if your approach is to memorize, you're going to lose. You're absolutely going to lose. It's not the skill that's being tested. Now, let's take a step back for a minute. The bar examiners, I suppose, would say you have to work hard in order to be ready for the test, but do they really reward extra hard work? In other words, if you work harder, do you get a higher score? And the answer seems to be pretty consistently no, they don't. That a minimum level of competence is what they're looking for on any exam in any jurisdiction. The multi-state bar exam, the test that's given across the country in almost every jurisdiction, requires in most jurisdictions about a 60 to 65% passing rate. In other words, you really have to get about 120 to 130 questions correct out of 200. That means that there's a lot of room for error. You could miss 70 questions and still pass. So when you work harder to get those extra 70 questions right, presuming that you could, and I'm saying you can't, but even if you could, there's a diminishing return. For each question that you get correct over a certain number, you've had to work exponentially harder, more time, more energy, and that takes away from other things. So as a result, one of the things that the bar examiners, I think, are doing is trying to measure whether or not you have good working skills. Do you really have the ability to balance your time, to balance your anxiety, your energy, to work in all of the different fields of the exam properly? It doesn't do you any good to be an expert in wills and trusts and blow every other subject. You've got to be balanced across the board. And balance doesn't come from working crazy, it comes from working smart. And so when people say to you, well, what you have to do is work harder, I'm not so sure I would take that at face value. You might have to work hard enough to have a minimum threshold, and if you're in a course like ours, we'll tell you exactly what that threshold is and what amount of work that is. If you're studying on your own or you're in another course, try and figure out what's a minimum that it would take, and if you really can't figure it out, use our numbers. It's about 250 to 300 hours on average to prepare for a multi-state and a state exam. That's about the amount of time you ought to plan on investing. If you're thinking that you need to invest 400, 500, 600, 700, 800, 900, 1,000 hours, oh, come on. You're just nuts. You're not going to be able to do that. And even if you did, the sad part is you're not going to keep it all in your brain. You're not going to remember it. You're going to look like a refugee from the haunted mansion when you get to the test site. That's not a way to take the test. It's a way to fall apart, to have fatigue, to collapse, to be sick. All sorts of bad things start to happen. So, like so many things in life, moderation is the key. Work productively, work consistently, work, but don't go crazy. And that's why this is such a dangerous myth. Well, I hope it's helpful to you to think about how hard to work and this myth number 8. I'm getting great feedback from people all over the world about this series. Apparently I've touched some nerves here with some of these myths, and gee, I haven't even gotten to the top 5 yet. But we'll be back again next week when we continue our countdown. And for this upcoming week, I would simply encourage you to work smart, not hard. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.